The night 12 people raised their hands to erase me from the family, my 8-year-old son watched his grandmother smile as if she had won something. They thought they were humiliating a grieving widow. They did not know I secretly owned the company standing between their empire and collapse. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. My name is Sophia Bennett. At 34, I survived rooms designed to break people. As a real estate investment CEO, I handled hostile acquisitions where one careless sentence could cost millions. I knew how to read silence. But none of that prepared me for Thanksgiving at the Whitmore estate. 2 years earlier, my husband, Daniel Bennett, died in a car accident outside Atlanta. He left behind Ethan and a voice message I could not delete. Since his funeral, I had avoided Whitmore gatherings. Every invitation came wrapped in judgment. Margaret Whitmore, Daniel's mother, was celebrated as the chairwoman of Whitmore Grand Hotels, a generous donor, and a woman of faith. In public, she kissed babies and funded scholarships beneath camera flashes. In private, she turned affection into leverage. Daniel once warned me that his mother did not forgive independence because she could not control it. I should have remembered that when her Thanksgiving invitation arrived. I accepted only for Ethan. He missed his father, and I wanted him to keep one piece of Daniel's family. By late afternoon, we entered the Whitmore estate in Buckhead, past clipped hedges, fountains, and rows of luxury cars. The mansion glowed against the cold sky, perfect from a distance and airless inside. Margaret greeted us in a burgundy silk dress with both arms open. She kissed Ethan's cheek, called him her precious boy, then held me 1 second longer than warmth required. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, smiling for the room. Her fingers tightened against my shoulder. Tonight should settle everything. Olivia Whitmore swept in wearing her polished social media smile, while Ryan Carter raised his glass like a man already celebrating. At dinner, the table glittered with crystal, silver, and inherited confidence. Conversation moved around me but never toward me. Several relatives glanced at Margaret before answering. Ethan ate quietly beside me, unaware that the adults around him were following a script. Then Margaret lifted a silver fork and tapped it against her wineglass. The sound sliced through the room. Chairs stopped moving. Smiles vanished. She rose, rested one hand beside Daniel's empty place setting, and looked directly at me. In that instant, I understood. This was never a family dinner. It was an ambush. Margaret rested both hands on the back of her chair and waited until every conversation disappeared. Years of leading charity galas and corporate banquets had taught her exactly how to command a room without raising her voice. "Before we enjoy dessert," she began warmly, "I'd like to say something about family." Several relatives smiled, expecting another speech about gratitude and faith. Margaret looked almost maternal beneath the chandelier, her expression soft enough to convince anyone who didn't know her. "The holidays remind us that love requires honesty," she continued. "Sometimes, protecting a family means making difficult decisions instead of comfortable ones." Her eyes slowly found mine. The warmth vanished so gradually that only I seemed to notice. "Since Daniel's passing, we've all tried to embrace Sophia with patience. We invited her to every holiday. We prayed for her. We offered support while she rebuilt her life." She sighed dramatically, allowing the silence to work in her favor. "Unfortunately, she has chosen distance over family." I remained still, not because I was intimidated, but because experience had taught me that people reveal far more when they believe no one will challenge them. Margaret interpreted my silence as surrender. She avoids church events. She refuses family traditions. She treats this family like an obligation instead of a blessing. Somewhere along the way, success became more important to her than the people who loved Daniel long before she ever met him. Several heads nodded around the table. None of them knew how many Sunday dinners I had quietly skipped because every visit ended with questions about my finances, criticism of my parenting, or subtle reminders that I would never truly belong. Margaret never mentioned those evenings. They didn't fit the story she wanted everyone to believe. Olivia gently placed her wineglass on the table before speaking. "I've tried so many times to reconnect with Sophia," she said with convincing disappointment. but every conversation feels like she's doing us a favor. She acts as though running an investment company makes her too busy for family. Her voice remained calm, carefully measured, the kind of tone that sounded sincere until someone noticed the satisfaction hiding underneath. Daniel spent his entire life protecting this family, Olivia continued. Sometimes I wonder if Sophia ever understood what that meant. The accusation lingered in the room. Ryan leaned forward next, folding his hands together like a corporate mediator. Grief changes people, he said thoughtfully. I've seen it happen before. Some people isolate themselves because success feels easier than vulnerability. He looked directly at me with rehearsed compassion. Sophia, nobody here is attacking you. We're concerned. Every relationship requires participation. Without trust and accountability, families eventually become strangers. His language sounded polished enough to impress anyone unfamiliar with manipulation disguised as empathy. I watched Ethan quietly push vegetables around his plate, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. That alone was enough to tell me this conversation had already gone too far. Margaret noticed the room leaning in exactly as she had planned. She slowly walked around the table, making eye contact with each relative before returning to the head of the room. No family survives without standards, she declared. If someone repeatedly rejects those standards, difficult choices become unavoidable. Then she looked directly into my eyes. Tonight, we're going to make one of those choices together. The air suddenly felt heavier. Every instinct sharpened inside me. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a carefully rehearsed performance, and every person in that dining room except Ethan and me already knew how it was supposed to end. Margaret slowly returned to her seat but didn't sit down. Instead, she rested one hand on the polished mahogany table as though she were chairing a board meeting instead of destroying her own family. I don't believe decisions like this should belong to one person, she said, her voice calm enough to sound reasonable. We're a family, and every family deserves a voice. A ripple of uneasy glances moved around the table. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, while others stared at their plates, already understanding where this was heading. Margaret took a slow breath before delivering the final blow. I'd like everyone to vote. If you believe Sophia should no longer participate in Whitmore family holidays, celebrations, or family affairs, please raise your hand. Time seemed to stop. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Olivia quietly lifted her hand, never taking her eyes off me. Ryan hesitated just long enough to appear thoughtful before raising his as well, giving the performance an illusion of fairness. One by one, the others followed. An uncle who had once thanked me for helping save his small business. An aunt whose medical bills I had quietly paid after Daniel's funeral. Cousins who had celebrated birthdays in my home and accepted my generosity without hesitation. 12 hands rose into the air. 12 silent verdicts. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't argue. I simply memorized every face, every expression, every person who had decided that loyalty was worth less than Margaret's approval. Across the table, Ethan stopped eating. His fork slipped from his fingers and landed softly against the china plate. He looked around the room, confused by the raised hands surrounding us. His eyes searched for Daniel's empty chair before finding me again. Mom? He whispered, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. Why is everyone looking at us? Before I could answer, he counted the raised hands one by one, as children often do when they're trying to understand something impossible. His breathing became uneven. Did, did we do something bad? That question struck harder than every insult Margaret had spoken all evening. I reached over and gently placed my hand around his small shoulder. No, sweetheart, I said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. Ethan tried to be brave. Daniel had always told him that courage wasn't about pretending not to be scared. It was about standing even when your knees wanted to give up. But he was only 8 years old. Tears slowly filled his eyes despite every effort to hold them back. I miss Dad, he whispered, his voice breaking. If Dad was here, none of this would happen. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. For one brief moment, I thought anyone might finally remember their humanity. Instead, Margaret's patience snapped. She struck the table sharply with the palm of her hand. Crystal glasses rattled across the linen cloth. Ethan, she said coldly, that's enough. Stop crying. The boy flinched so violently that his entire body trembled beside me. Margaret didn't soften. This is exactly what happens when children aren't taught emotional discipline. Every difficult conversation becomes a performance. She looked directly at me before delivering words she could never take back. Daniel would be heartbroken if he saw how weak his son has become. The sentence hung in the air like shattered glass. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Years in corporate negotiations had taught me that real danger arrives when emotion suddenly disappears. I looked down at Ethan as he buried his face against my arm, trying to hide tears he shouldn't have been forced to shed. In that silent moment, every promise I had made to Daniel came rushing back. Protect him. Always choose him first, no matter who stands in your way. And I realized something with absolute certainty. This dinner had never been about humiliating me. It had become something far worse. They had chosen to wound an innocent child just to satisfy their own pride. That was the exact moment I stopped seeing the Whitmores as family and started seeing them as a problem that needed to be solved. I rose from my chair so slowly that the movement itself drew every eye in the room. The silence became almost unbearable. Ethan instinctively reached for my hand, and I held it firmly, letting him feel a confidence I was still forcing myself to maintain. Margaret remained standing at the head of the table, convinced she had finally broken me. She mistook composure for surrender. It would become the most expensive miscalculation of her life. Are we finished? I asked quietly. My voice carried no anger, only disappointment. Nobody answered. Several relatives suddenly found the tablecloth far more interesting than looking into my eyes. They had voted with confidence, but now they couldn't bear to face the consequences of that decision. I looked around the room one last time. You all had a choice tonight, I said. Not one of you was forced to raise your hand. An elderly uncle lowered his head. A cousin nervously adjusted his napkin. Even Olivia's confident smile faded for a brief second before she forced it back onto her face. Only Margaret remained completely unmoved. Don't try to guilt anyone, she replied. People simply recognized what this family needs. I nodded once. No, they recognized what you expected. Her jaw tightened ever so slightly. For the first time that evening, she realized this conversation was no longer following the script she had written. I turned toward Ryan. You spoke about accountability, I said. Remember those words. They'll matter more than you realize. Ryan frowned, unsure whether I was threatening him or simply making an observation. Then I faced Olivia. One day you'll discover that public approval disappears much faster than personal integrity. Her expression hardened immediately, but beneath the confidence I caught something else. Uncertainty. Finally, I looked back at Margaret. You spent years teaching everyone in this house that loyalty means obedience. I paused. Daniel believed loyalty meant protection. The mention of Daniel's name caught everyone off guard. Margaret's eyes flickered toward the empty chair that still sat beside hers every Thanksgiving. He protected this family even when it cost him personally. I continued. He believed love was something you gave, not something you demanded. Margaret interrupted sharply. Don't tell me what my own son believed. I met her stare without blinking. I'm telling you what he told me. The room fell silent again. Ethan looked up at me, listening carefully. I gently squeezed his shoulder before kneeling beside him. Put your coat on, buddy, I said softly. We're going home. He nodded immediately. There wasn't even a trace of hesitation anymore. As I helped him zip his jacket, I noticed several relatives watching us with growing discomfort. Their confidence was beginning to crack. They had expected tears, shouting, maybe even begging. Instead, all they saw was a mother calmly choosing her child over a room full of people who had just rejected them both. As we walked toward the front entrance, Olivia couldn't resist one last remark. Don't expect to come back after this, she called across the foyer. I stopped with my hand resting on the bronze door handle but never turned around. You keep assuming I'm the one who's losing something today, I replied. You're wrong. Then I opened the door. Cold November air rushed inside, replacing the suffocating warmth of the mansion. Ethan stepped outside first. I followed, quietly closing the heavy wooden door behind us. The loud thud echoed through the house like the end of a chapter. Neither of us spoke while walking toward the car. Once Ethan was safely buckled into the back seat, he looked at me through tear-filled eyes. "Mom," he whispered. "Did Grandma really mean all those things?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror before starting the engine. "Sometimes people become so afraid of losing control," I answered gently, "that they stop recognizing the people they claim to love. But listen to me carefully." I waited until he met my eyes. "Nothing they said tonight changes who you are. And from this day forward, no one will ever make you feel small just to make themselves feel important." Ethan slowly nodded. The drive home was quiet, but not empty. While the city lights reflected across the windshield, grief slowly gave way to clarity. By the time we reached the underground garage beneath our penthouse, I wasn't thinking like a widow anymore. I was thinking like the CEO who had spent an entire career dismantling organizations from the inside out. After carrying Ethan upstairs and making sure he was asleep, I walked alone into my office. I unlocked my encrypted phone, opened one secure contact, and typed 7 words to the only person I trusted with what came next. Victoria. It's time to activate Phoenix Protocol. The following morning, Atlanta woke beneath a cold gray sky, but inside my penthouse everything felt unusually quiet. I stood in the kitchen watching coffee drip into my favorite porcelain mug while Ethan slept peacefully down the hall. The silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind that follows an explosion, when the dust is still hanging in the air and nobody yet understands how much has been destroyed. My phone vibrated relentlessly across the marble countertop, missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, messages from distant relatives, notifications from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. I ignored every one of them until a secure alert from Victoria Hayes appeared on the screen. "Turn on the news. Olivia is moving first." I opened the attached live stream. Olivia sat inside the Whitmore mansion wearing an oversized cream sweater, no jewelry, and almost no makeup. Every detail had been carefully calculated to project vulnerability. Behind her, a framed family portrait featuring Daniel occupied the perfect position in the camera shot. She lowered her eyes before looking directly into the lens. "I never imagined our family would experience something like this," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "Yesterday, we opened our home and our hearts to Sophia. Instead of finding peace, she verbally attacked my mother, frightened Ethan, and walked away from the only family Daniel ever wanted him to have." Thousands of comments poured across the screen in real time. "Praying for your family. She sounds unstable. That poor grandmother." Olivia paused frequently, allowing viewers to fill the silence with sympathy. She never shouted. She never exaggerated. The performance was dangerous because it felt believable. Then she delivered the line she knew would spread fastest across social media. "Some people mistake success for character. Money may buy influence, but it can never replace family." The comment section exploded. I quietly closed the video before it ended. Anger would have been the easiest response, but it also would have been the worst one. Victoria called seconds later. "The live stream already has more than 50,000 views," she reported. "Margaret also filed paperwork removing your name from the Daniel Bennett Memorial Scholarship Foundation." Ryan signed the documents this morning as the new executive director. I walked toward the windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. The scholarship wasn't just another charitable project. Daniel and I had designed it together during long evenings when we talked about creating opportunities for students who worked hard but lacked financial resources. I personally funded the original endowment because Daniel believed kindness should outlive the people who created it. Margaret hadn't simply erased my name. She had attempted to rewrite Daniel's legacy as though I had never existed. For a brief moment, grief returned with unexpected force. Then it disappeared, replaced by something far more useful: clarity. "What do you want to do?" Victoria asked. "We can file defamation claims today. We can challenge the scholarship changes immediately. Legally, we're in an excellent position." I remained silent for several seconds before answering. No, Victoria didn't interrupt. She knew I hadn't finished. They're celebrating too early, I continued. Every interview Olivia gives, every legal document Margaret signs, every public statement Ryan approves. They're creating evidence with their own signatures attached. If we attack now, they'll become cautious. They'll hire better advisors. They'll stop making mistakes. Victoria laughed softly. You're giving them room to destroy themselves. Exactly. I opened the secure Northbridge Capital dashboard on my tablet. Financial reports, lease summaries, and compliance records immediately filled the screen. Begin a complete forensic review of Whitmore Grand Hotels, I instructed. Every property, every lease, every vendor payment, every outstanding obligation. I don't want assumptions. I want facts. Already underway, Victoria replied. Then accelerate everything, I said. While they're busy winning a public argument, we're going to learn exactly how vulnerable their business really is. After ending the call, I deleted every social media application from my phone. I refused to waste energy defending myself before strangers who had already accepted someone else's version of the truth. Real battles aren't won inside comment sections. They're won through patience, preparation, and timing. Down the hallway, Ethan stepped into the kitchen carrying his backpack. "Morning, Mom," he said with a small smile that hadn't been there the night before. Seeing him smile reminded me why I couldn't afford to lose focus. This was never about protecting my reputation, it was about protecting his future. And somewhere across Atlanta, Margaret Whitmore still believed she had forced me into retreat. She had no idea that the silence she interpreted as weakness was actually the sound of a strategy quietly coming to life. 3 days later, Margaret finally did exactly what I expected. My private phone rang just after lunch while I was reviewing investment proposals in my office. Her name appeared on the screen, but this time I noticed something different. She had waited. That meant she believed enough time had passed for emotions to settle. People like Margaret always confuse silence with surrender. I answered on the fourth ring. "Sophia," she began, speaking with exaggerated professionalism. "I'm calling as chairwoman of Whitmore Grand Hotels regarding company assets." I leaned back in my chair, allowing the silence to encourage her confidence. "Go ahead." "During a routine financial review," she continued, "we discovered you're still driving the 2023 Range Rover registered under the company. Since you voluntarily separated yourself from this family, I expect the vehicle returned immediately. Please leave the keys with security at the estate before tonight." There wasn't a hint of gratitude in her voice. She knew Daniel had asked me to register the SUV under the company years earlier to maximize depreciation during a difficult tax season. She also knew every payment, insurance premium, maintenance bill, and custom upgrade had come directly from my personal accounts. None of that mattered now. She wasn't trying to recover a vehicle. She was trying to prove she still had power over me. "Of course," I replied pleasantly. "I'll have it delivered this evening." The silence on the other end lasted almost 5 seconds. She had prepared herself for an argument, not immediate compliance. "Good," she finally said. "I'm glad you've decided to be reasonable." The call ended. I looked out across the Atlanta skyline before reaching for another contact. Michael Brooks answered before the second ring. "Need another favor?" he asked. "Tonight," I replied. "Midnight. Bring your best technicians. A flatbed truck, heavy tools, and 4 concrete blocks." He laughed quietly. "I'll be there." Shortly after midnight, the underground garage beneath my building echoed with the sound of pneumatic tools. The black Range Rover sat beneath bright fluorescent lights while Michael's crew worked with remarkable precision. Every custom component I had personally purchased disappeared one piece at a time. Premium forged wheels, performance tires, imported audio system, custom navigation module, upgraded interior trim, security equipment, specialized lighting. Every receipt was already stored inside Victoria's evidence archive, proving beyond question that those improvements belonged to me, not Whitmore Grand Hotels. 2 hours later, the SUV still technically belonged to the company, but it no longer resembled the luxury vehicle Margaret had imagined reclaiming. Resting on temporary transport wheels, stripped of every premium enhancement, it looked more like a vehicle waiting to be restored than one ready to impress Buckhead neighbors. Michael carefully loaded it onto the flatbed, and together we drove through nearly empty streets toward the Whitmore estate. Daniel's old security code still opened the front gate without resistance. The truck rolled slowly up the circular driveway before stopping directly in front of the mansion. Hydraulic arms lowered the SUV onto 4 concrete blocks positioned carefully across the polished stone entrance. Even in darkness, it looked impossible to ignore. I walked toward the windshield carrying a cream-colored envelope. Inside was one handwritten sentence. Company property returned exactly as requested. Personal property retained exactly as permitted by law. I tucked the note beneath the windshield wiper and quietly stepped back. There was no shouting, no damaged property, no broken windows, no revenge. Only compliance executed with absolute precision. By 7 o'clock the following morning, my phone erupted with calls. Margaret called first, then Ryan, then Olivia. Voicemail after voicemail filled my inbox. Minutes later, angry text messages arrived accusing me of sabotage, vandalism, and malicious behavior. I archived every message without replying. Each emotional outburst became another time-stamped record for Victoria's legal file. While the Whitmore family spent their mornings staring at a dismantled luxury SUV in front of their mansion, they never stopped to ask themselves a far more important question. If I had willingly surrendered something that expensive without a fight, what exactly was I protecting instead? That question would haunt them much sooner than they ever imagined. The following morning, I arrived at Sterling and Cole 15 minutes early. I preferred empty conference rooms. They gave me space to think before strategy turned into execution. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta pulsed with its usual rhythm, completely unaware that one of its most recognizable hospitality families was only days away from financial collapse. Victoria Hayes entered carrying 3 leather portfolios instead of one. She placed them on the conference table without a word. That alone told me everything. She had found more than we expected. "You were right," she said, as she opened the first file. "Whitmore Grand Hotels isn't failing because of recent events. It's been surviving on borrowed time for years." She spread several property maps across the polished table. Every flagship hotel was highlighted in blue. "Do you remember the week Daniel asked you to meet him after midnight?" she asked. I smiled faintly. I remembered every detail. Daniel had looked exhausted that night. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and for the first time since I had known him, he admitted he didn't know how to save his mother's company. Their commercial landlord had refused another extension. The banks had stopped returning calls. Within months, Whitmore Grand Hotels would have lost every prime location it operated from. Daniel never asked me to rescue Margaret. He asked me to protect hundreds of employees who depended on those hotels for their livelihoods. He knew his mother would rather lose everything than accept financial help from me directly. So together we designed another solution. Instead of becoming the lender, I became the invisible landlord. Northbridge Capital quietly purchased every commercial property before foreclosure proceedings could begin. The transactions were completed through multiple holding companies, independent trustees, and private investment entities. Everything was perfectly legal. Everything was intentionally invisible. Margaret believed an institutional investment fund had rescued her business. She spent years boasting about her remarkable negotiating skills, while unknowingly sending monthly lease payments to a company that ultimately belonged to me. Victoria slid certified ownership records across the table. Every title is clean. Every transfer was properly recorded. Every beneficial ownership structure has been verified. Even if Margaret hires the best attorneys in New York, they won't find a single procedural weakness. I slowly turned another page. There was Ryan Carter's signature. Fresh, confident, dated only 4 days earlier. "He really signed it?" I asked. Victoria nodded. Without requesting outside counsel, without reading the revised provisions. He wanted Margaret to believe he could handle executive decisions alone. She projected the updated lease onto the conference room screen. The rent adjustment isn't even the dangerous part. She highlighted another section buried deep within the contract. Mandatory structural compliance, fire suppression upgrades, accessibility renovations, elevator modernization, electrical infrastructure improvements, total required investment, $500,000. Completion deadline, already expired. Inspection reports confirm they never completed any of it. Victoria explained. No permits, no contractors, no construction, nothing. I leaned back slowly. Ryan had been so eager to impress Margaret that he had unknowingly reaffirmed every enforcement right Northbridge Capital already possessed. He thought he signed a routine renewal, Victoria continued. Instead, he activated the accelerated default clause. The room became quiet. Outside, helicopters crossed above the skyline while morning traffic flowed beneath us. Inside, the final pieces settled into place. Margaret had spent years believing she controlled every conversation, every relationship, and every decision inside her family. Yet the single most important asset sustaining her empire had never belonged to her at all. Daniel understood that secret. I understood it. No one else did. Victoria closed the final portfolio. Once the demand letter is served, she said, their entire future changes. I looked once more at the ownership certificates before carefully closing the folder. No, I replied quietly. Their future changed the moment they decided humiliating my son was worth more than protecting the people Daniel spent his life trying to save. Victoria studied me for several seconds before giving a small nod. She understood exactly what this had become. It was no longer about revenge, it was about accountability. And for the first time since Thanksgiving night, every move ahead belonged entirely to us. By Sunday morning, the Whitmore estate looked like it had fully recovered from Thanksgiving. Luxury cars once again filled the circular driveway, live jazz drifted across the garden terrace, and catered brunch tables overflowed with fresh seafood, pastries, and champagne. Margaret had invited relatives, church leaders, and several influential business associates to celebrate what she proudly called a new beginning for Whitmore Grand Hotels. Ryan Carter stood at the center of every conversation, wearing a tailored navy suit and accepting congratulations as though he had personally rescued the company. Olivia floated through the room, introducing him as the brilliant financial executive leading the family into its next chapter. Watching from a distance through reports from our investigator, I almost admired their confidence. They had mistaken temporary silence for permanent victory. At precisely 11:15 a.m., a black sedan entered the estate and stopped in front of the mansion. A licensed process server stepped out carrying a single Navy envelope embossed with the silver seal of Northbridge Capital. He asked only one question. Is Mr. Ryan Carter, Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Grand Hotels, available? Hearing his new title spoken aloud filled Ryan with visible pride. He straightened his jacket, smiled politely, and signed the delivery receipt without reading the sender's name. Several guests assumed it was another corporate contract or congratulatory package. Ryan carried the envelope back into the dining room, joking that success seemed to arrive faster than expected. Margaret smiled approvingly from the head of the table. Open it, she encouraged. Let's see what our newest executive has received. Ryan broke the seal. The smile disappeared almost instantly. His eyes raced across the first page, then returned to the heading as though refusing to believe what he had just read. Every trace of color drained from his face. The room slowly grew quiet. Olivia stepped closer. Ryan? She asked softly. What's wrong? He didn't answer. His hands began trembling so noticeably that several pages slipped onto the polished dining table. Margaret frowned, walked over, and took the documents from him. The bold title at the top of the first page immediately caught her attention. Notice of accelerated default and demand for immediate payment. She continued reading. The letter stated that Whitmore Grand Hotels had materially breached multiple provisions of its commercial lease agreement by failing to complete mandatory safety and infrastructure improvements. Pursuant to the accelerated default clause executed by Ryan Carter during the recent lease renewal, Northbridge Capital formally demanded payment of $500,000 within 7 calendar days. Failure to comply would authorize immediate termination of every commercial lease, repossession of the occupied properties, and lawful seizure of qualifying business assets to satisfy the outstanding obligation. Margaret reread the paragraph twice before lowering the pages. $500,000? She whispered. Ryan finally found his voice. I I never saw that clause. Margaret slowly turned toward him. You signed the agreement. It looked identical to the previous lease. He answered weakly. I thought it was just a routine renewal. You thought? Margaret repeated, her voice becoming dangerously quiet. You signed a multi-million-dollar commercial contract because you thought? The celebration ended instantly. Guests stopped eating. Conversations died. Several church members quietly exchanged worried glances. Olivia grabbed the papers, scanning them herself before looking back at Ryan in disbelief. Tell me this isn't real. He couldn't. Every page carried his own signature beneath language he had never bothered to read. Across Atlanta, I sat in my office beside Victoria Hayes as a notification appeared on her encrypted tablet. Delivery confirmed. Documents accepted and signed by Ryan Carter at 11:18 a.m. Victoria looked up with a small smile. The clock has officially started. I nodded once before closing the file in front of me. No, I said quietly. The countdown started the moment they believed humiliating my son would never have consequences. Today, they're simply becoming aware of it. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound inside the dining room came from the soft jazz still drifting in from the patio, completely unaware that the celebration had just become a crisis meeting. Margaret read the demand letter again, hoping she had misunderstood its language. She hadn't. Every sentence was painfully precise. 7 calendar days, $500,000, immediate default, lease termination, asset seizure. There was no emotional appeal to challenge, no individual to intimidate, and no family loyalty to exploit. It was simply a legally enforceable contract. Ryan reached for the documents with trembling hands. Margaret, let me explain. She slowly looked at him, and for the first time since anyone could remember, fear had replaced authority in her eyes. Explain? She asked quietly. Tell me how the chief financial officer signs a commercial lease without reading every page. Ryan swallowed hard. The renewal matched the previous format. I believed. You believed? Margaret interrupted sharply. You believed? Her voice echoed across the silent dining room. Executives don't believe, Ryan. They verify. Before he could answer, another notification sounded from Margaret's tablet resting beside her champagne glass. Normally, she ignored incoming emails during family events, but nothing about the morning was normal anymore. She unlocked the screen and frowned at the sender. The message contained no greeting, only an attachment titled Independent Forensic Financial Audit, Whitmore Grand Hotels. Olivia leaned closer. What is it? Margaret opened the file. The first page contained an executive summary supported by bank records, accounting ledgers, transaction histories, surveillance timestamps, and vendor reconciliations. She read only 3 paragraphs before every trace of color disappeared from her face. No, she whispered almost to herself. Ryan immediately recognized the expression. Whatever Margaret had just discovered frightened her even more than the demand letter. She continued reading aloud, her voice growing colder with every sentence. $150,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, fabricated maintenance invoices, altered vendor payments, falsified operating expenses. The room became perfectly still. Then came the names attached to the transactions. Ryan Carter. His breathing stopped. The report continued with relentless precision. Every missing dollar had been traced. Offshore gambling platforms, luxury hotel suites booked under false names, jewelry purchases, lease payments for a downtown condominium, designer boutiques. International wire transfers. Each transaction was accompanied by supporting documentation, dates, banking confirmations, and digital authorization records. There was nowhere to hide. Olivia stared at her husband in complete disbelief. "Ryan," she whispered, "tell me this is fake." He opened his mouth, but no words came. Margaret slowly lowered the tablet before looking directly into his eyes. "You stole from this company?" Ryan immediately shook his head. "It wasn't supposed to become this big. I was going to pay everything back." The confession landed like an explosion. Olivia stepped backward as though she had been physically struck. "You actually did it?" she cried. "Everything I've defended. Every person I attacked for you." Tears filled her eyes before anger replaced them almost instantly. "You used my family." Ryan reached toward her. "Olivia, listen." She slapped his hand away before he could touch her. Around the room, guests quietly gathered their coats. Business associates who had arrived expecting champagne and celebration suddenly wanted nothing to do with the scandal unfolding before them. Church leaders slipped toward the exit without saying goodbye. Within minutes, the mansion that had been full of admiration stood nearly empty. Margaret remained frozen beside the dining table, surrounded by untouched food and abandoned champagne glasses. The illusion she had spent years protecting had collapsed in less than 15 minutes. Across the city, Victoria Hayes called the moment our investigator confirmed the audit had been opened. "Exactly as predicted," she said. "They're not discussing Northbridge Capital anymore. They're tearing each other apart." I stood beside the windows of my office overlooking Atlanta's skyline. "Good," I replied quietly. "A divided opponent never has enough strength to fight the real battle." Victoria laughed softly. "You didn't destroy the Whitmores." I looked out across the city before answering. "No, I simply forced the truth into the same room as their lies." Outside, the city carried on as though nothing had happened. Inside the Whitmore estate, however, every relationship built on control, appearance, and deception had begun collapsing under its own weight. And with only 6 days remaining before the payment deadline expired, Margaret finally understood the terrifying reality she had refused to see. The greatest threat to her empire had never been Northbridge Capital. It had been the people she trusted most. By the sixth evening, the silence surrounding the Whitmore family had become louder than any public scandal. Every bank had rejected their emergency financing requests. Investors refused to risk capital after reviewing the company's deteriorating financial position. Vendors began demanding cash before shipments. Even longtime business partners quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a company balancing on the edge of insolvency. The empire Margaret Whitmore had spent decades building wasn't collapsing because of one demand letter. It was collapsing because years of pride had hidden problems that no one was ever allowed to question. Early the next morning, I sat on my balcony sharing breakfast with Ethan before school. He smiled while explaining his science project, completely unaware that the people who had once made him cry were now desperately searching for someone to save them. Watching him laugh reminded me what victory truly looked like. It wasn't revenge, it was peace. My phone finally rang. "Margaret." I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Gone was the commanding executive who had controlled every room she entered. Her voice sounded tired, fragile, almost unfamiliar. "Sophia," she whispered, "please, I need to speak with you." I remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I've contacted every bank, every investor, every friend I have." Her breathing trembled. "No one will help us. If the hotels close, hundreds of employees will lose their jobs. Families who have nothing to do with our mistakes will suffer." I quietly looked across the table at Ethan, who was packing his backpack before leaving for school. "Margaret," I asked softly, "do you remember Thanksgiving?" She didn't answer. "Do you remember asking 12 people to vote against me while Ethan watched?" The silence on the other end grew heavier. "Do you remember telling your grandson that Daniel would be ashamed of him?" A quiet sob escaped before she finally spoke. I was wrong. Those 3 words carried none of the certainty they should have carried. They sounded less like accountability and more like desperation. Are you apologizing because you understand what you did? I asked calmly. Or because your company is about to disappear? Margaret couldn't answer. She didn't need to. We both knew the truth. I slowly walked into my office where Daniel's framed photograph rested beside my desk. For a long moment, I simply looked at it. Then I remembered something he had told me only weeks before the accident. If my family ever forces you to choose between protecting them and protecting Ethan, promise me you'll choose our son. At the time, I laughed and called him dramatic. He smiled and said he hoped I would never understand why he asked. Standing there, I finally did. Everything I had done since Thanksgiving wasn't revenge. It was the promise I had made to the man I loved. I returned to the call. Northbridge Capital will honor every contract exactly as written, I said. Margaret's breathing quickened. Then, there's nothing left? There is one path, I replied. Resign as chairwoman of Whitmore Grand Hotels. Permanently remove Ryan Carter from every executive position. Cooperate fully with law enforcement and the financial investigation. Transfer operational control to an independent board supervised by Northbridge Capital until the company is financially stable. Publicly acknowledge the truth instead of hiding behind appearances. And one more thing. I paused before speaking the words that mattered most. You will never again decide whether Ethan deserves your love. That choice belongs to him when he's old enough to make it for himself. Margaret quietly cried on the other end of the line. I'll agree, she whispered. Everything. Have your attorneys contact Victoria Hayes, I answered before ending the call. 4 weeks later, Whitmore Grand Hotels reopened under completely new executive leadership after an extensive financial restructuring overseen by Northbridge Capital. Hundreds of employees kept their jobs. Ryan Carter faced criminal fraud charges. Olivia disappeared from social media after the investigation exposed the truth behind the family's carefully crafted image. Margaret resigned from every public position she once treasured and quietly faded from Atlanta's business circles. A month later, I visited Daniel's grave with Ethan. We placed fresh white lilies beside the headstone as the autumn wind moved gently through the cemetery. Ethan slipped his hand into mine and looked up. Dad would be proud of you, wouldn't he? He asked. I smiled through tears that finally felt peaceful instead of painful. I hope so, I answered, because everything I did began with a promise I made to him. As we walked back toward the car, the weight I had carried since Daniel's death finally lifted. The Whitmore family believed they had voted me out of their lives. In reality, they had unknowingly given me something far more valuable, the freedom to stop surviving the past and finally begin living the future Daniel always wanted for Ethan and me.